The crackle of vinyl hitting the turntable. The smell of embassy cigarettes and spilled lager at your local pub. The sound of proper rock and roll before synthesizers and drum machines ruined everything. If you grew up in Britain in the 1970s, you witnessed the greatest decade of British music ever recorded, and we found 15 bands from that era that we desperately want back. Mark Bolan turned up on Top of the Pops in 1971 with glitter on his cheekbones, and British rock and roll was never the same. T-Rex gave you Get It On, Telegram Sam, and Metal Guru. 3-minute bursts of pure swagger that your older sister fancied and your dad thought was ridiculous. Bolan had that voice, that guitar sound, and that ability to make glam rock feel dangerous rather than daft. And every Thursday night you'd wait to see what he'd wear and whether he'd smash his guitar. The bloke was untouchable until that fatal car crash in '77 took him away far too young. Now we've got manufactured pop stars who can't play instruments and wouldn't know a proper riff if it hit them in the face. But T-Rex represented British music when it was raw, sexual, and unapologetic, before everyone started worrying about being cool or relevant. Bolan's death robbed us of seeing where he'd have taken glam into the 80s, and no amount of tribute acts can replace what we lost that September morning. Roxy Music were too clever for their own good and too stylish for the working class to fully embrace. But they gave the 70s some of its most interesting music. Brian Ferry turned up looking like a lounge lizard who'd wandered into a rock band, and somehow it worked. Virginia Plain, Love is the Drug, Avalon. You didn't always understand what Ferry was on about, but you knew it sounded expensive and continental, like music for people who drank wine instead of bitter. Brian Eno's synthesizers made everything sound futuristic, and the whole package felt like Britain trying to be sophisticated instead of just loud. Ferry's still touring, but it's not the same without the original lineup and that 70s edge where art school met rock and roll. Roxy Music proved British bands could be intelligent and successful without dumbing down, and their influence is all over everything that came after. We want them back not because they were the biggest, but because they were the most interesting. And interesting is exactly what modern music isn't. Slade were what happened when 4 lads from the Black Country decided to make the loudest, most direct rock and roll imaginable, and somehow it became massive. Come on, feel the noise. Mama, we're all crazy now. Merry Xmas, everybody. Noddy Holder screaming his lungs out while your dad complained it wasn't proper music. They spelled everything wrong on purpose, dressed like your mum's curtains had exploded, and made music for football terraces and working men's clubs rather than art students and critics. Every single was 3 minutes of pure energy, and you didn't need a degree to understand what they were about. Now Christmas comes round and Merry Xmas everybody is still everywhere, reminding everyone what we lost when Slade stopped being massive. They represented a Britain that was unpretentious and proud of it, where working class lads could become rock stars without pretending to be something they weren't. We want Slade back because modern music has forgotten that being loud, direct and fun is enough. You don't need to be deep or meaningful to matter. The Sweet started as teeny bopper material and ended up as one of the most musically talented bands of the 70s, and most people still don't realise it. Ballroom Blitz, Teenage Rampage, Fox on the Run, pure glam rock that your sister loved and you secretly quite enjoyed despite pretending it was rubbish. But when they dropped the glitter and recorded Love is Like Oxygen, suddenly everyone realised Brian Connolly could actually sing and the band could actually play properly. They were stuck in the middle, too pop for the rock crowd, too rock for the pop crowd, and never got the respect they deserved. Connolly's dead now, and the original lineup's gone, but what remains is the memory of a band that could do both commercial success and musical credibility without compromising either. The Sweet proved you could wear platform boots and still be serious musicians, something modern acts haven't figured out because they are either one or the other. We want them back because they represented glam rock at its most musically competent, before punk came along and decided competence didn't matter. 10cc made music that was too clever for its own good, and somehow they still had massive hits, despite being art school graduates who thought in concepts. I'm Not in Love, The Things We Do for Love, Dreadlock Holiday. Every single was different, every album was an experiment, and you never knew what they'd do next. They could do doo-wop, reggae, rock and orchestral pop all in the same album, and it all sounded distinctly British rather than like they were copying Americans. The production was immaculate, the lyrics were witty, and the whole package felt like music for people who actually listened rather than just heard. Now we've got producers who think clever means adding more effects, but 10cc proved clever meant having ideas and executing them perfectly. They represented a Britain that could be intellectual without being pretentious, accessible without being dumb. We want them back because modern music has forgotten that you can make people think and make them dance at the same time, and that pop music doesn't have to be stupid to be popular. Supertramp took progressive rock and made it accessible, which annoyed the prog purists and the pop fans in equal measure. Dreamer, The Logical Song, Breakfast in America. Roger Hodgson's voice was unmistakable, and Rick Davies' keyboards made everything sound both sophisticated and immediate. They were too pop for the prog crowd and too prog for the pop crowd, stuck in that awkward middle ground where commercial success didn't translate to critical respect. But Crime of the Century was a genuine masterpiece that took you on a journey without losing you in 20-minute solos. Davies is still touring, but without Hodgson it's like watching half a band, and the magic that made them special in the 70s has vanished with age and separation. Supertramp proved that progressive rock didn't have to be inaccessible, that you could have complex arrangements and actual tunes people remembered. We want them back because they represented ambition in pop music, the idea that you could challenge your audience without alienating them completely. Jeff Lynne had this mad idea that rock and roll needed string sections, and somehow Electric Light Orchestra made it work better than anyone expected. Mr. Blue Sky, Livin' Thing, Don't Bring Me Down, massive production, orchestras mixed with rock guitars and melodies that stayed in your head for days. They were Birmingham lads making music that sounded expensive and ambitious, proving that British bands could think big without flying off to America first. Every ELO single sounded like a Phil Spector production, updated for the 70s, and nobody else was doing anything remotely similar. Lynne's still making music, but ELO in the 70s had an energy and ambition that age and nostalgia tours can't recapture. They represented a Britain that wasn't afraid to be bombastic and excessive, where more was definitely more, and subtlety was for people who couldn't afford proper production. We want them back because modern music is terrified of sounding too big or too ambitious, and ELO proved that bigger and more ambitious was exactly what pop music needed. Queen were too much for most people in the 70s, too theatrical, too bombastic, too everything, but Freddie Mercury didn't care what anyone thought. Bohemian Rhapsody shouldn't have worked, 6 minutes of opera mixed with rock that made no sense on paper, but it became the biggest single of the 70s because Mercury and the band had the talent and audacity to pull it off. Every Queen performance was an event, every single was different, and Mercury commanded a stage like nobody before or since. They were Britain's answer to American rock excess, except British, and therefore better. Mercury's gone, and the band touring now with Adam Lambert is fine, but it's not Queen without Freddie's voice and presence. Queen represented British rock at its most confident and ambitious, when we weren't copying Americans but doing our own thing and doing it better. We want them back because Freddie Mercury was irreplaceable, and modern music has nobody with even half his charisma, talent or willingness to risk looking absolutely ridiculous in pursuit of greatness. The Jam arrived in '77 just as punk was exploding, and Paul Weller gave British kids something to believe in that wasn't anarchy or chaos. Down in the tube station at midnight, Going Underground, Town Called Malice. Proper songs about proper British life, working class frustration channeled into 3-minute bursts of energy. Weller wore a suit instead of ripped clothes, proving you could be angry and articulate at the same time. And the Jam became the most successful band of the late 70s without compromising an inch. They were mods in a punk era, and somehow that made them more relevant than everyone else. Weller's still making music, but the Jam captured a specific moment in British history that can't be recreated no matter how many reunion offers he turns down. They represented young, working-class Britain when it still had hope mixed with anger before Thatcher crushed the unions and turned fury into resignation. We want the Jam back because Weller understood what it meant to be young and British in a way nobody has since, and that connection between artist and audience has been lost in the decades since they split. The Police took reggae rhythms, punk energy, and pop sensibility and created something nobody else was doing in the late 70s. Roxanne, Message in a Bottle, Walking on the Moon. Sting's voice, Stuart Copeland's drums, and Andy Summers' guitar created a sound that was sparse, tight, and completely distinctive. They were too poppy for the punk crowd, too punk for the pop crowd, and too successful for the critics to take seriously until years later. Every Police song sounded stripped down and immediate, three blokes in a room making more noise than bands twice their size. They reunited briefly in 2007, but it was nostalgia rather than necessity, and the spark that made them essential in the 70s had long since dimmed. The Police represented British music stealing from everywhere, reggae, punk, jazz, and making it work through sheer talent and chemistry. We want them back because modern bands overproduce everything, but the Police proved that less was more if you were good enough to pull it off. Fleetwood Mac started as a British blues band and ended the 70s as the biggest band in the world, and somehow they remained essentially British, despite living in California. Go Your Own Way, Dreams, Don't Stop. Rumours was the soundtrack to every divorce and breakup in the late 70s, and the band made dysfunction sound beautiful. Mick Fleetwood and John McVie were the British rhythm section, holding everything together while the Americans wrote the hits. And that combination of British steadiness and American drama made them unstoppable. They're still touring in various formations, but the Rumours era magic depended on chemistry, cocaine and chaos that age and therapy have smoothed away. Fleetwood Mac proved British musicians could conquer America without losing their identity, that you could be commercially massive and still make music that mattered. We want them back because they represented Britain at its most flexible and adaptable, taking American music and making it better through British discipline and musicianship. Bad Company were what happened when Paul Rodgers left Free and formed a supergroup with Mick Ralphs, and the result was pure British blues rock swagger. Can't Get Enough, Feel Like Making Love. Shooting Star, straightforward rock and roll without pretension or complexity, just four blokes playing music that sounded expensive despite being simple. Rodgers had one of the best voices in British rock, and Bad Company proved you didn't need to be clever or experimental to be great. You just needed to be good at the fundamentals. They reformed several times with different lineups, but without Rodgers' voice, the band lost what made them special in the first place. Bad Company represented British blues rock at its most confident and American-friendly, when British bands could cross the Atlantic and dominate without changing who they were. We want them back because modern rock has forgotten that sometimes simple and direct is exactly what's needed, and that virtuosity without showing off is the mark of real talent. Steve Harley and Cockney Rebel were too weird for mainstream success and too talented to ignore. And Make Me Smile, Come Up and See Me was the perfect example of both. Harley's voice was theatrical and affected. The arrangements were orchestral and complex, and the whole package felt like British music trying to be David Bowie without copying him. They had one massive hit and several cult classics, and the fact they never became huge says more about British audiences than about the band's talent. Harley's still performing, but Cockney Rebel captured a specific moment in mid-70s Britain when glam was dying and punk hadn't arrived, and weird was briefly acceptable. They represented British music's experimental phase, where musicians were willing to try anything before punk came along and decided simple was better. We want them back because Harley proved you could be theatrical and working class at the same time, and that originality was more important than commercial success. Thin Lizzy weren't technically British, they were Irish, but they made their name in Britain, and Phil Lynott became one of the 70s most distinctive frontmen. The Boys Are Back in Town, Whiskey in the Jar, Jailbreak, those dual guitar harmonies, Lynott's voice, and songs about working class life that felt authentic, because they were. Lynott was one of rock's first black frontmen, and he carried himself with a swagger that made you forget about race and just focus on the music. Every Thin Lizzy song felt like a story from the pub, relatable and real. Lynott died in '86, and without him, Thin Lizzy lost its soul despite various reunions and tribute acts. They represented an era when rock and roll was still dangerous, when bands lived the life they sang about, and sometimes paid the price. We want them back because Lynott was irreplaceable, and modern rock has lost that connection to real working class experience that made Thin Lizzy feel essential rather than optional. Bowie wasn't a band, but he defined the 70s more than any group, and his backing musicians were good enough to be bands themselves. Starman, Rebel Rebel, Heroes. Every year brought a new Bowie, a new persona, a new sound, and somehow it all worked. He was Ziggy Stardust, then Aladdin Sane, then the Thin White Duke, changing faster than audiences could keep up, but always staying ahead of everyone else. Bowie proved British musicians could be artists as well as entertainers. That reinvention was possible, if you had the talent and courage to pull it off. He's gone now, and his final albums proved he was still innovating right until the end. But we'll never see another 70s Bowie, because that moment in British culture can't be recreated. He represented British music at its most ambitious and fearless, when being different was celebrated rather than punished. We want him back because Bowie showed that you could be anything you wanted if you had the talent to back it up. And modern music has nobody with even a fraction of his vision, courage, or ability to constantly reinvent themselves while remaining essentially themselves. From Bolan's glitter to Bowie's reinvention, from Slade's anthems to Queen's bombast, the 70s gave us bands we'll never see again. If this brought back memories, hit subscribe and watch the next video on screen. Cheers for watching.